So what's wrong with this picture? Well now, allow me to explain. Okay, so disused railway stations are not uncommon at all in Britain, but this town is one of a kind in multiple respects. Why? Because its former railway station hasn't been taken over by a trendy coffee shop, luxury flats, or even an Aldi in the case of my own hometown, but instead remains visually frozen in time, appearing much as it would have done in its Victorian heyday, apart from two important details: trains and tracks. Oh, and it's said to be the only station in the world built within the bailey of a castle. This makes it the perfect visual representation of how a once mighty industry was brought to its knees in the space of less than a decade. Plus, the town in question boasts one of the most fascinating histories in all of East Anglia. So let me tell you the story of Clare. When the story begins is a matter of speculation, though archaeologists indicate that it goes all the way back to the Stone Age. What we can say with a good degree of certainty is that at the time of the Norman conquest, it was one of the wealthiest settlements in Suffolk. The Domesday Book of 1086 records there being 40 burgesses, i.e., wealthy citizens, living here, when most other parts of Suffolk didn't even have one. Thus, it was in the interest of William the Conqueror to bestow the land here, as he often did, to one of his closest supporters. In this case, the honour fell upon Richard Fitzgilbert, making him the first Lord of Clare, and thus the House of Clare was born. This speaks to the importance of the place, especially considering Richard was gifted nearly 200 other manors in England, but only this town would bear his future family's name. To defend his new territory in Suffolk, he built Clare Castle. This was constructed in the typical Norman motte and bailey style, and later fortified in stone. Fitzgilbert's descendants would later take the family name de Clare. Among these was Richard de Clare, the 8th Lord of Clare. In 1248 he established Clare Priory. Richard invited Augustinians here from Normandy, and thus it became the first house of the Augustinian friars in England. But as with all others of its kind, it was dissolved by Henry VIII during the Reformation. Another descendant of particular note was Elizabeth de Clare. Born in 1295, she was one of Edward I's granddaughters. After her brother Gilbert was killed in 1314 at the Battle of Bannockburn, Elizabeth became one of the wealthiest heiresses in England. At the age of 26, she became a widow for a third and final time, but nevertheless lived a lavish lifestyle into her 60s, with Clare Castle being one of her main residences. During the 1330s, she re-endowed University Hall in Cambridge, from which point it became known as Clare Hall, and later Clare College, which is the University of Cambridge's second oldest surviving college of today. As for the castle, it eventually changed hands from the House of Clare to the House of York. Its ruin is believed to have been a gradual process starting from around the time of the Wars of the Roses in the 15th century, when the stonemasonry is likely to have been stripped down for use in other buildings, for want of a decent local quarry. But aside from family wealth, what was behind the growth of Clare? In a word, wool. After Edward III began heavily taxing the export of raw wool in the 14th century to help finance the Hundred Years' War, those engaged in the industry decided instead to hold on to the raw product and weave it themselves. Help came in the form of skilled Flemish weavers who were invited to immigrate by Edward III himself. Thus, a cottage industry developed, centred around towns and villages that had not only a good supply of sheep nearby, but also a river running through. Why a river? Because this provided the means of fulling, i.e. the process of shrinking woolen cloth in water and eliminating impurities, either with a mill or with a cruder technique, namely just trampling on it. The river in this case is none other than the Stour, an iconic river which defines a large part of the natural border between Suffolk to the north and Essex to the south. Clare is one of a series of settlements along this river that became known collectively as wall towns. These are typified by genuine Tudor or medieval timber-framed buildings and a fine parish church whose construction was made possible by the revenue the wool industry provided. Clare's parish church, dedicated to St Peter and St Paul, dates back to the 13th century, although the nave and chancel were rebuilt in the 15th century, coinciding with a period in which Suffolk's wool dominance was peaking. But this wasn't to last. In the Elizabethan era, a new wave of Protestant weavers from Flanders, fleeing religious persecution in the Spanish Netherlands, ended up largely snubbing Suffolk and instead heading for the neighbouring counties of Norfolk and Essex, among other places. Although the final nail in the coffin was the Industrial Revolution, which left all of East Anglia unable to compete with the mills of the North and the Midlands. Whilst the power of steam ultimately killed the cottage textile industry, it brought about a whole new industry in the 19th century, which is where we come full circle. The railway arrived in Clare in 1865, although, as you'll have likely already gathered, this was no ordinary station. The company responsible was the Great Eastern Railway. A few years prior to its opening, they began to dig straight through the Norman Bailey of Clare Castle, a decision which seems shocking today, but bear in mind that for all the advancements the Victorians gave to the world, which I'm not downplaying at all, conservation wasn't their strongest suit. The station formed part of the Stour Valley Railway, a line of track which ran from the village of Marks Tay near Colchester to the village of Great Shelford near Cambridge, and thus connecting two main lines together. In addition to passengers, the station also transported commodities. At its peak, around 80,000 sacks of grain were transported through here in the space of a year. But this story has a villain, and his name was Richard Beeching. In 1961, he became chairman of British Rail, or as it was known at the time, British Railways. In 1963, he published an ominous report titled The Reshaping of British Railways. In short, due to the emergence of motorway travel, coupled with the supposed unprofitability of certain lines of track, it was proposed that Britain's rail network should lose around a third of its stations within the decade. In the case of Clare, the Beeching axe, as it's often coined, fell in March 1967. Now, to play devil's advocate for just a second, Beeching wasn't the first to close railway stations that had been deemed unprofitable, but to close 2,363 stations in the space of just a few years, that is hard to stomach, and more so still considering how few of these stations have since been reopened, which number in merely dozens. To Beeching, these may have appeared as little more than names on a map, but it's with visual aids that we can truly appreciate its magnitude. To that end, let's explore the neighbouring settlements of Clare. First off, in the westerly direction, about 2 miles away, is a small village of Stoke by Clare. Home to around 500 residents, this has the vibe of somewhere you might expect Miss Marple to be called in to investigate a shocking murder. But as you might have already gathered by the name, its history is intertwined with its namesake town, or more specifically, its namesake family. This was once home to a Benedictine priory founded in the 12th century by Richard de Clare, grandson of Richard Fitzgilbert, i.e. William the Conqueror's pal. The priory is long gone, and in its place are a school and a church. The Grade 1 listed Church of St John the Baptist, whilst once part of the abbey, consists largely of early 16th century flint, consistent with a timeline of prosperity in the era of the wool industry, and so too did Stoke by Clare have a railway station, up until March 1967. Heading west still, we come to the town of Haverhill, another town that owes much of its historic prosperity to the wool trade, although a great fire of 1667, would you believe, robbed it of many of the timber-framed buildings you'd come to expect in such a place. Nevertheless, one surviving building was Anne of Cleves House, one of various buildings gifted to Henry VIII's fourth wife upon their divorce. The town was also home to a railway station along the same line of track until it too closed in March 1967. But this closure is particularly remarkable. Why? Because Haverhill is home to over 26,000 people. For locals without a car, their major lifeline is a regular bus service to and from Cambridge. It's also one of only a few towns with direct buses to Clare. Meanwhile, to the east of Clare, we have a remarkable neighbouring town, Sudbury. This was also a prosperous wall town in the medieval era, aided by its situation along the River Stour, and hence sharing many similar architectural traits. But Sudbury comes with a twist, in the form of arguably its most famous son, Thomas Gainsborough. Born here in 1727, Gainsborough became a leading artist of his era and a founding member of the Royal Academy. Although he's largely known for his portrait commissions, which included George III, his true passion, according to letters he wrote, was of painting the landscapes in and around his hometown and similar areas, a trait he shared with another artist from the Suffolk-Essex border, John Constable. Although their lives only overlapped by 12 years, these two helped put Suffolk and the River Stour on the map as a place of natural beauty. In fact, you could quite literally say there's something in the water here. As for Sudbury's railway station, well, that survived the Beeching cuts, but only in one direction, because it was here that the proverbial axe fell in 1967, cutting off Sudbury's direct connection to Cambridgeshire via Clare. Thus, the Stour Valley Railway was reduced to a short branch line to Marks Tey in Essex, with its terminus here, and the name of this branch? The Gainsborough Line. But what then of the Clare of today? Well, this is one of many towns and villages that share a similar public transport related pickle, but in Clare's case, its preserved former railway station, with grass growing where the tracks once lay, makes for the perfect metaphor for what Richard Beeching and his ilk did to the country in the 1960s. Imagine, if you will, over 2,000 other stations looking just like this, and the picture would soon become clear. The story then is not so much about Clare, but about the rail industry itself, an industry that's facing fresh challenges of its own in the present day. Will it get back on track, or has it already gone off the rails? But speaking as I am, as someone who's travelled the length and breadth of the country on public transport, I'd like to end on a note of genuine optimism, which is that maybe a rival industry will step up and become the backbone of our smaller historic towns. Or maybe it already has. Thanks for watching and have a great day.